Overload is a mechanic that was originally introduced in 2012's Return to Ravnica, where it was the Izzet mechanic. It's an alternate casting cost for an instant or sorcery that has the word target in the text box, and if you pay the overload cost, you change the word target to each. For example, Dragon Shift normally makes one target creature you control into a 4/4 dragon, but if you overload it, it turns each creature you control into a 4/4 dragon. Overload can be pretty powerful, especially if the spell it's on is passable, even when you don't overload it, as it tends to give you a later game mode that is incredibly powerful. In all, there are 28 cards with Overload, and it's been a pretty successful mechanic because 16 of those 28 cards have put up top 8s at Magic's highest level of competition. In this video, we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours. And a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Damn. For 2 black mana, it's a sorcery that destroys target creature, and a creature destroyed that way can't be regenerated. It also has Overload for 2 generic and 2 white. So, when you overload it, it destroys each creature. In other words, this is Wrath of God with upside, because when you overload it, it effectively becomes Wrath of God. But unlike Wrath, Damn can also be a removal spell in the early game. Damn is for Modern Horizons 2, so the only 60 card formats it's ever been legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. All of its top 8 so far have come in Modern, where it's appeared in a variety of black-white decks that have access to both modes, like Orzhov Midrange, Esper Control, and Black-White Reanimator. It's likely to continue to put up top 8s going forward, and it'll probably move up the list. It's also pretty fun that this card is a callback to not only Wrath of God, but also Damnation. At number 9, it's MXs Mastery. For 3 generic and a red, it's a sorcery, and it exiles target instant or sorcery from your graveyard, and for each card exiled that way you copy it and you can cast it for free, then you exile the Mastery. It also has Overload for 5 generic and 3 red, and if you pay that cost, you get to cast each instant or sorcery in your graveyard for free. It was originally printed in Commander 2015, so it's never been legal in formats like Standard, Pioneer, or Modern, but it did get a reprint in the Strixhaven Mystical Archive, which means it's on Magic Arena, and that also means it's legal in Historic. An arena-only format that was used for some top events between 2021 and 2022. In that format, it was played in decks built entirely around Time Walk effects like Time Warp, and it was all about casting them as many turns in a row as possible to gain an insurmountable advantage, and you can see how MXs Mastery helps you get there, since it can make 1 Time Warp give you 2 extra turns. You don't even have to overload it to get insane value when you're casting Time Warp from the graveyard. The deck was insanely dominant, taking up 5 of the top 8 slots at the Strixhaven Championship. Ultimately, Time Warp got banned in the format because of this deck, and it doesn't appear that Historic is going to be used for major events anymore either, so the Mastery is probably done putting up top 8s. At number 8, it's Winds of Abandon. For 1 generic and a white, it exiles target creature you don't control, and then its controller searches their library for a basic land card and puts it into play tapped. Its overload cost is 4 generic and 2 white, and if you do that, you get to exile each creature you don't control, and your opponent gets to grab a land for each of them. So this is basically a worse path to exile when you cast it normally, but it also has the upside of being a one-sided board sweeper, which is pretty sweet, and oftentimes by the time you have the 6 mana to do that, giving your opponent a bunch of lands is a price worth paying for you to utterly take over the game. Winds of Abandon is for Modern Horizons, which means the only 60 card formats it's been legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. It's appeared in many different white decks in Modern, ranging from Eldrazi aggro to blue-white control. Probably the nastiest deck to use the Arbiter are Hate Bear decks that run Leon and Arbiter alongside it. With the Arbiter in play, you can almost entirely take away the downside of Winds of Abandon. Winds has never been heavily played in Modern, but it's seen consistent play there since being printed in 2019, and it's going to continue to add to its score. At number 7, it's Vandal Blast. For 1 red, it's a sorcery that destroys target artifact you don't control. Its overload cost is 4 generic and a red, and then it lets you destroy each artifact you don't control. So it's a passable artifact removal spell before you overload it, and it's a one-sided artifact board wipe when you do. This has made it an attractive sideboard option in multiple formats, especially in Modern, where it's found the most consistent success. That's not too surprising, since artifact decks have been a big factor in Modern since the day the format was created in 2011. It's especially nice to bring in if your deck also uses some artifacts, since most other artifact sweepers will take yours with it. However, Vandal Blast hasn't put up any top 8 since 2022, and the more active cards we've looked at so far are likely to pass it in the future. At number 6, it's Scale Up. For 1 green mana, it's a sorcery, and until end of turn, target creature you control becomes a 6/4 worm. Its overload cost is 4 generic and 2 green, and then it makes each creature you control into a 6/4. Obviously, that's a pretty great stats boost for 1 mana, so even when you don't overload this gives you a pretty great stats boost for 1 mana, although it can be a little bit risky as a sorcery. However, there is one deck in particular that has been able to take advantage of Scale Up since it was printed in Modern Horizons in 2019. Those are, of course, Infect decks in both Modern and Legacy. Infect decks are all about playing creatures with the keyword, who do damage to the opponent in the form of poison counters, and if your opponent ever has 10 or more poison counters, they lose the game on the spot. These decks have always specialized on getting one Infect creature in play and buffing it and protecting it to poison your opponent out in the very early game. Scale Up works great there, as making your Glistener Elf put 6 poison counters on the opponent on turn 2 is pretty insane, and usually you can do way more than that thanks to other buff spells. For example, if you happen to have 2 Mutagenic Growths, you can actually win in a single swing. Scale Up is going to continue to put up top 8s in the future. At number 5, it's Break the Ice. For 2 black mana, it's a sorcery that destroys target land that is snow, or could produce colorless mana. Its overload cost is 4 generic and 2 black, and then it destroys each land that is snow or could produce colorless mana. This is a powered down version of the very powerful Sinkhole, but it's still a pretty great land destruction spell, at least in the right matchup. Since being printed in Modern Horizons 2 in 2021, Break the Ice has seen heavy sideboard play in Modern, a format with many decks reliant on lands that Break the Ice can destroy, most notably Tron decks, which try to assemble the 3 Urza's Tron lands that can produce 7 mana when they are all in play. Break the Ice lets you break up the Tron before it ever happens, or if you only get it after they've assembled it, you can completely annihilate it by overloading Break the Ice. Break the Ice is going to continue to be an essential sideboard card in Modern, so it's likely to put up more top 8s in the future. At number 4, it's Counterflux. For 2 blue and a red, it counters a spell you don't control, and it can't be countered by spells or abilities. Its overload cost is 1 generic, 2 blue, and a red, in which case it counters all spells you don't control. In other words, if you overload it, it counters every single spell on the stack you don't control. While there isn't always a big stack of spells waiting to resolve, when there is, this is a game-winning play in most cases, and it still has a baseline of a decent counterspell. While it was in Block and Standard, it was played in Jeskai control decks, and it also has a single top 8 from a Pioneer Izzet control deck. It's seen the most play by far in Modern though. It's especially good against Storm decks in the format. Normally it's pretty hard to counter every Storm copy on something like Grape Shot, but an overloaded Counterflux counters every single copy, and because the Storm player can't counter Counterflux, that usually means they lose the game. However, Counterflux hasn't put up any top 8 so far in 2024, so there is a chance Break the Ice surpasses it in the future. At number 3, it's Cyclonic Rift. If you're primarily a Commander player, there's a good chance you thought this would be even higher, but it's merely really good in 60-card formats and not a format staple like it is in Commander. Anyway, for 1 generic and a blue, it's an instant that bounces a non-land permanent you don't control, and you can overload it for 6 generic and a blue, in which case you get to bounce each non-land permanent you don't control. This is another overload card with a baseline that's a decent enough card. Paying 2 to bounce something isn't terrible, but the overload mode can be absolutely game-breaking. Obviously, 7 mana is a lot, but there have been decks in multiple formats that are up to the challenge of generating that sort of mana. In Standard, it was usually played in Blue Devotion decks, which could use Nykthos Shrine to Nyx to make the necessary mana. In Pioneer, Lotus Field decks can easily cast it for the overload cost, since they are all about tapping and untapping Lotus Field as many times as possible in a turn. And in Modern, it's usually featured in Tron decks, which can even cast it overloaded on turn 3. It's still seeing play in Pioneer and Modern right now. At number 2, it's Mummortars. For 1 generic and a red, it's a sorcery that does 4 damage to target creature you don't control. 2 mana to do 4 is a really good rate. It lets you trade up for way more expensive creatures because it's so efficient. So it's the kind of card that would always see play in standard formats, so even if the card stopped there, it would be pretty good. But it's on this list, so obviously it also has Overload, in this case for 3 generic and 3 red, which lets you do 4 to each creature you don't control. This makes it a great removal spell not only for aggro decks who are happy to pay 2 mana to kill something and attack the opponent, but also for control decks that can get some nice value out of the board sweeper mode late. Unsurprisingly, it was a dominant, heavily played card when it was in Standard, seeing play in virtually any red deck. It amassed 74 points in the format while it was legal there, putting up insane finishes at multiple events, like 5 of the top 8s at the 2013 World Championship. Since rotating out of Standard though, it's slowed down in a big way, only putting up 10 points since then, seeing occasional play in both Pioneer and Modern, but it hasn't put up a top 8 in any format since 2023, and in the long run, Cyclonic Rift will probably pass it. And at number 1, it's Electrickery. I'm willing to wager that exactly 0 of you watching this video knew what would be at number 1 this time. For 1 red mana, it's an instant that does 1 damage to a creature you don't control, and it's got Overload for 1 generic and a red, in which case it does 1 damage to each creature you don't control. That may not sound very exciting overall compared to what we've seen on this list, but Electrickery is the cheapest, most efficient way in the game to do 1 damage to only one side of the board. Most other cheap red cards that do 1 or 2 damage to everything also damage your creatures, and over the years that has made Electrickery a surprisingly important card in multiple formats. In fact, it's put up points in every single format it's ever been legal in, even Legacy and Vintage. However, it's Pauper, a format where only commons are legal, where it's done the most by far. That's also really the only format where it sees main deck play, as most decks in Pauper are reliant on small creatures. Electrickery is going to put up many top 8s in Pauper while also finding occasional success in other formats. Given that Mummortars has completely stalled out, Electrickery is likely to remain the number 1 card on this list for the foreseeable future. So, those are the top 10 Overload cards in Magic. If you want to cast some spells with Overload, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future MTG top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to make sure you're caught up on the 800 other MTG top 10s, including many more that look at specific mechanics and keyword abilities, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.